Good afternoon. I'm David Wilkove. I have the great pleasure of introducing today's Bradford seminar speaker, Tong Mu. Tong began at Princeton as a doctoral student in the Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology, and I had the pleasure of being his advisor. And then after he had finished his dissertation, I asked him to stay on as a postdoc here in the Policy School in the Center for Policy Research in Energy and Economics because I was so interested in his work, and it was the anchor for a lot of work that people in my group were doing related to the topic of bird conservation. Now, Tong arrived in Princeton already keenly interested in birds, especially migratory birds, having developed that interest while an undergraduate at Peking University. After arriving here, he quickly developed a fascination with the shorebirds of the East Asian Australasian flyway. And so that's the set of birds like sandpipers, plovers, curlews, and other species that nest in Siberia, in far western Alaska, and they largely winter in Australia, New Zealand, and Southeast Asia, and they pass through the China coast during migration. So they actually make some of the longest journeys of any migratory birds, and as I suspect Tong will soon explain, they're in a great deal of trouble. What I think distinguishes Tong's research is that he asks pretty fundamental questions about the ecology of these birds that generate insights that are genuinely novel and useful for conservation. Now, a lot of ecologists doing fundamental research like to say that their work is going to be useful, even essential, for addressing the biodiversity crisis. But in reality, most of it is not. And Tong's work is an exception here. He employs a wide range of approaches to understanding the conservation needs of these birds, and as you'll see, he has studied them throughout their vast ranges. Tong has also built strong collaborative networks with researchers in China that have been really valuable to my research group and to others. And I'm very grateful to him for that. So as I think you'll see, it's an impressive body of research, it's ongoing, and you should find it quite interesting. With that, let me welcome Tong Mu.
Thank you so much, David, for this really generous introduction. It's my great honor to be here to talk about my research on the ecology and conservation of migratory birds. But I want to begin my talk by saying that it is actually no better place than here in New Jersey to talk about migratory birds and their conservation, because New Jersey is one of the top places for the bird watchers to see bird on migration within the country. And it is also the place where you see a lot of interesting conservation topics related to their conservation. Many of you might have heard about the issue about red knots, which are these little red birds here, and horseshoe crabs in the Delaware Bay, where every spring tens of thousands of shorebirds, including the red knot, they congregate along the southern coast of New Jersey. And it is one of the few cases where you can actually see a large congregation of those migratory species during migration. And there is even fewer places where you can see large congregations of land birds migrating in the country. And this again in Cape May back in 2023 in the morning where Alex, Rini, and I had a spectacular morning observing this bird during migration. And in just 4 hours, Alex counted there were more than 20,000 birds passing through. And I think this video don't really do the justice of how amazing the birds are, because the birds are actually just everywhere. And I can probably go on and on about how amazing migration is and how interesting it is to see bird migration. But apart from being a wonder of nature, migratory species also bear very critical ecosystem functions and services. Their trophic effects as herbivores, predators, and prey play a huge role in the food webs. But those functions are similar to those provided by non-migratory species. So what's more unique about migratory species is their transport effect, where they move a lot of good and perhaps not so good things in human sense around the globe and contributing significantly to the global nutrient and energy cycles. And all those different services and ecosystem functions, they rely heavily on the sheer volume of migratory species that move around the globe each year. But that sheer volume is declined very rapidly. You might have heard about the decline of 3 billion birds in the United States in the past 30 years, and of which 80% are contributed by migratory birds. And it's actually not just about birds. From mammals to fish to insects, almost all of the migration taxa are in decline throughout the globe. And in this sense, these migratory species are actually a sentinel for the global changes. They inhabit some of the fastest changing habitat, including the polar regions, the tropical forest, coastal wetland, and inland wetland. And the decline in their abundance also means the decline in the critical ecosystem functions and services they provide to us. And all those habitats and functions are tightly linked to the sustainability of the local communities and their local livelihood. However, migratory species are also very challenging to study, and that's possibly one of the major reasons why they're declining so fast. So comparing to non-migratory species that usually stay at a single site with some local movement, but the changes and threats they face can usually be studied and detected locally. On the contrary, for migratory species, they move across multiple sites throughout the year, which means that any changes at those sites and any threats they face at any of those sites may affect their populations. And for many species, we don't really know where they go and what kind of threats they're facing throughout the migration cycle. And there are other species showing as this yellow lag, which depends on totally different habitat throughout the annual cycle, which means that they may use the northern forest for breeding, and they use coastal or inland wetland during migration and wintering, which just add another layer of complexity for us to study and conserve them. And to put all those challenges in context, I'll show you a result from my tracking study up in Russia. So for the red-necked stint, I tracked 3 individuals that breed in the Arctic tundra of Russia. So one of them migrated through Russia along the coast down to Indonesia. The second one migrated through a more inland habitat route and wintered in Thailand. And the third one wintered in northern Australia. So we can see that to just conserve these 3 different individuals, a small, tiny population of the red-necked stint that breed not farther than 2 kilometers apart from each other. You need to conserve the Arctic tundra, the inland coastal wetland, and 3 distinct wintering habitat, or 3 distinct wintering sites that are more than 5,000 kilometers apart from each other. So the main goal of my research is basically to try to see how we can address these challenges in studying and conserving migratory species. So to address the challenges in studying them, I want to see how we can better identify the different threats and quantify those threats that are leading to population declines in those species. And based on this more ecological and mechanistic understanding of their migration, how we can facilitate more feasible, effective, and equitable conservation actions on the ground. And in my opinion, the shorebirds are actually a great model system to study them, because you can see that they inhabit some of more open habitats, so they're easy to detect and easy to monitor. And their population size has actually been well monitored at both local and global scales. And their migration patterns, unlike some of the forest bird or land birds that migrate in large waves throughout the continent, their migration are constituted of 2 distinct steps. So they have this long-distance non-stop flights, And between the flights, they have extended stopovers at a few key sites where the majority of the population congregates. The more familiar example is again the red knot that winter in Tierra del Fuego and Brazil. So each spring, they migrate more than 8,000 kilometers nonstop from South America to the Delaware Bay, where they feed on the horseshoe crabs for more than a month. So this combination of long-distance nonstop flight that making them more sensitive to the habitat changes, and they're inhabited of the open habitat makes them more detectable, and the ability for us to really measure their responses to those habitat changes makes the shorebirds particularly good sentinels for the global changes. And as David mentioned, my work on the ground has been focused mostly on the East Asian Australasian flyway, or the EAAF. So on this map, this yellow area shows the breeding ground, including Mongolia, Russia, northern China, and Alaska. And they all winter in the large expanse of coastal area in Southeast Asia, Australia, and New Zealand. But you can see that this gray bands shows their migration routes, and most of them concentrate in this tiny little area shown in red, which is the Yellow Sea area, their main stopover habitat. And along this flyway, there are around 20 shorebird species, primarily using the coastal habitat. And among them, more than 17% are listed as threatened or near threatened by the IUCN Red List. And the reason behind them being listed as threatened or near threatened is primarily because of their rapid population declines. Because a suite of threats that they're facing along this flyway, including habitat loss, illegal hunting and bycatch, pollution, climate change, and infectious diseases. And I have worked on many of those different threats with a wide network of collaborators, but my main focus and the main threat to those shorebirds are their loss of the intertidal stopover habitat in the Yellow Sea area, where evidences from the breeding ground, the stopover habitat, and the wintering site all pointing to this loss of stopover habitat as a main threat. However, at the very beginning of my PhD with David, I noticed something very puzzling. So when we look at the average rate of population decline in those habitats, it's about 1.2% per year. But when we look at the decline of shorebird populations, some of them, they're declining much, much faster than the rate of habitat loss. Some of them more than 20-fold faster than the rate of habitat loss. So I had this question. My main research in this part, so it's sort of a narrow down of the main goal, but focusing mostly on the habitat loss. So how can this small losses of habitat lead to large population declines if habitat loss is indeed a key driver of their population trajectory? And based on the understandings to this question, which threats, species, or sites should receive prioritized conservation actions? And these different threats, different questions need to be addressed across different scales because the birds are moving through large scales. So I look at their habitat selection within the individual site at a very local scale, as well as how to identify the limiting sites that are the sites that are most limiting population growth at the regional scale. And also, I will finish by talking about some of my ongoing work of those birds at the flyway scale. So I will start with this habitat selection within individual sites. So the key stopover habitat there for the shorebirds are the intertidal mudflat. And you can see it's very amply named. It's intertidal, see a lot of mud there, and it looks rather flat. And from the appearance of one of my field assistants, you can see just how enjoyable it is to work in those habitats. Although from these two photos, you see that the habitat may seem lifeless, but if you're there at the right time, at the right season, you can see the habitat is actually filled with birds. And also want to draw your attention to this figure. It just shows how expansive this habitat can be. From the land, which is shown here by the concrete seawall, out to the shallow sea, it stretches something on average 2 to 3 kilometers wide. And in some places, it can be more than 30 kilometers wide. So it's actually a large expanse of habitat that's not usually seen in many of the places around the world. So one of the common arguments that we hear from the local developers that are developing the tidal flat for commercial development or industrial development is that given that this habitat is so huge, that maybe we can develop some of it without affecting the birds. But I felt that there's something off in this argument because the tidal flat actually not so flat, and the tiny elevational gradient along this intertidal gradient actually plays a huge role in determining the ecology of the intertidal habitat as well as the ecology of the shorebirds that are using this habitat. So this tidal flat or this intertidal habitat is bounded by the high tide line and low tide line. So between those two areas, the tide rises and falls throughout the tidal cycle following a pretty regular pattern. And depending on this submerging and exposure pattern, this area can be further divided into the upper, the middle, and the lower zones. And if we now take a bird eye view from above, this gradient of exposure time will look like something like this. So if we now have this bar chart, schematic plot showing the high tide period, where most of the habitat is underwater, shown by this light blue band. And this ripple line shows the waterfront or the tide front, and this gray area shows the exposed tidal flat. And this concrete block here shows where the seawall is, which is what usually bounds the upper tidal flat in China. So you can see that during high tide, only a small portion of the habitat is exposed. And when the tides are either rising or falling, more and more habitat got exposed. And then during low tide, almost the entire habitat is exposed. So we can see that the upper tidal zone is actually where it's exposed for the longest period, whereas the lower tidal zone is actually the place where it's mostly underwater throughout the tidal cycle. So although this gradient or this differences in their exposure time has been well recognized in this habitat, but actually what we know about the shorebird habitat selection within this temporarily changing habitat is actually pretty fragmented. Our knowledge about their habitat selection is either concentrated during high tide, when most of the birds are concentrated in this small area for the ease of bird population monitoring, or during low tide, when the entire tidal flat is exposed, so it's easy for mapping their food resources and their bird distribution. So we actually have a huge gap in knowing what the birds are doing throughout the tidal cycle, especially during when the tides are either rising or falling, which is a majority of the tidal cycle. So my research is the first one that actually quantified the shorebird distribution throughout the tidal cycle, throughout the full tidal gradient, asking two questions. The first one is whether all shorebirds have similar foraging distributions throughout the tidal cycle on the tidal flat, and whether based on the different distribution patterns, potentially different distribution patterns, whether different parts of the tidal flat are equally important for those shorebirds. And to answer those two questions, I set out this transects in two of the major stopover sites in Nanpu near Beijing and Rudong near Shanghai. So here on the map, this grayish area is the land, the white area is the sea, and the stippled area is where the full extent of the tidal flat is. And I have this transect ranges from 2 kilometers to 5 kilometers, covering the entire tidal gradient. And with a dedicated team of volunteers, we counted where the birds are throughout the tidal cycle in each of those plots, on average, with an average interval of 30 meters. And this is what we found. So I actually found that the birds are much more different than what people have previously thought. There were not just one uniform distribution of the shorebirds, but there are at least 3 different types. Many of you might have seen this short film called Piper by Pixar or Disney. If not, highly recommended. It's a great short movie. And it actually shows exactly what most people think shorebirds do, which is exemplified by these standardings here, that they forage while following the tide. So they forage while the tide is out, and then pushed back by the birds, by the tide. So if we plot these tide followers on this schematic representation, will look like something like this. So the tide followers, they forage always close to where the tidal front is. However, in addition to this most typical shorebird foraging types, I also found that there are actually two additional types where the shorebirds are using the tidal flat. One of them is what I call the upper dome specialist. Basically, they just forage on the upper tidal dome even when the tide is far out. And there's a third one called the generalist, which basically forage whenever and wherever it is exposed. So they more or less uniformly distributed on the exposed tidal flat. And I have developed a set of statistical tests to see how we can more quantitatively describe and bin those different types, which I won't get into details here. But with those tests, we found that actually most of the species at my site are either generalist or upper dome specialist. And the upper tidal dome specialist the tide followers only constitute just a small portion of all the shorebirds on the tidal flat. And because we have quantified their distribution throughout the tidal cycle, we can actually further quantify how important each of those segments of the tidal flat are for the foraging shorebirds by taking into consideration both how many birds are there throughout the tidal cycle and how long they're foraging there. So we can actually see for those different segments, the upper, the middle, and the lower zones, how many birds are there during the tidal cycle and how long they spend foraging there. And what we found is that, not surprisingly, the upper tidal flat is disproportionately important for those foraging shorebirds. So on this bar plot here, a box plot here, this yellow box shows the upper tidal dome, the green shows the middle dome, and the blue shows the lower dome. On the y-axis is the proportion of the cumulative foraging time that the shorebirds spend there in each of the segments, and they add up to 1 because it's a proportion. We can see that for generalists, on average, each species would spend more than 17% of their foraging time on the upper tidal dome, partly because the upper tidal dome is exposed for the longest period for the generalist. And for the upper dome specialist, for on average, more than 80% of the foraging time are spent on the upper tidal dome, which is not surprising because that's where they forage, basically. And it's only in the tide followers where different zones are used more or less evenly. And the reason, because the reason of the disproportionate importance of the upper tidal dome is actually not just because of the longest availability of the upper tidal dome. So my collaborators and I also showed that the upper tidal dome is also where holds the most richest food resources for those shorebirds. We can imagine that if the tidal flat, they are just exposed for a longer period, but there's no food there, the bird would have already moved on to other places. So there actually is where the most food-rich part for the shorebirds. And we can imagine then that in this case, a small loss of the tidal flat can actually lead to a large population decline if the habitat loss is actually concentrated on the upper tidal flat, because that's where most food spend their foraging time at, and that's where their most food resources are, which is sadly exactly what has happened. So the human activities on the tidal flat almost always affect the upper tidal dome first. We can imagine if there's a coastal development, people will almost always start developing the area that's closest to the seawall because that's the highest part, that's the easiest part to build another seawall, basically, to extend the existing seawall. And also, in the case of the invasive species, which is shown by this green grass in the background here, they're basically transforming the upper tidal flat into salt marshes, making it inhabitable for the foraging shorebirds in that part of the world. Sea level rise is also affecting the upper tidal zone disproportionately, which may be counterintuitive for some of you at first. But if you think that the effect of sea level rise is basically increasing the sea level, on average sea level for the area, and is actually reducing the average exposure time for the entire tidal gradient. So basically, it's making some of the lower tidal flat into permanent shallow sea, will no longer exposed. We will transform the middle tidal dome into lower tidal dome, and transform some of the upper tidal zone into the middle tidal zone. So although seemingly the effect of the sea level rise is coming from the seaward side, but it's actually affecting the landward side of the tidal flat disproportionately. And it's actually not just sea level rise from climate change, but some of the actions we're having that to address climate change are actually also affecting the upper tidal zone disproportionately, including mangrove afforestation and the expansion of renewable energies directly on the tidal flat. Now we're seeing in China along the coast. So the conservation message that we had for this part is pretty straightforward. We simply need to protect the entire tidal gradient, especially the upper tidal flat, because whenever you do something to the tidal flat, it's almost always the upper tidal flat got affected, and that's where the most food are for the shorebirds, and that's where the shorebirds spend most of their foraging time. And this has been one of my favorite, well, the favorite part of my thesis, because the most rewarding part is to see it's actually making some real-world changes. Back in 2017, to address this ongoing threat from coastal development on the tidal flat, my collaborators and I wrote a policy paper in both English and Chinese, in which we summarized what we know at that time about the effect of habitat loss, especially this coastal development on coastal shorebirds, in which I summarized some of the preliminary findings of this part of the work, including the 3 types of different shorebird distribution patterns, but also more importantly, this disproportionate importance of the upper tidal zone, as well as how a seemingly small amount of habitat can lead to large population declines. And we handed this policy paper to both local and global international NGOs. And a year later, we saw this national policy came out that actually restricted the coastal development throughout China's coast. So although the policy making process there can be a little bit vague, so we don't really know how much our policy paper actually contributed to this national policy. But what I heard is our policy paper actually appeared in many of the high-end meetings that led to this national policy. And a year later, in 2019, our paper was also cited in this decision to inscribe some of the important stopover sites along China's coast as World Heritage Site. And David actually once joked about the fact that it is one of the few cases where he's aware of that research has already made some real-world impact before it's formally published, which may be a good thing. So now that I have talked about this qualitatively, that we know this loss of upper tidal flat can have detrimental effect on shorebird populations, you may begin to wonder if there's a way for us to really quantify how much habitat we need to protect for the shorebirds, or how much habitat we can afford to lose. And this led to the second part of my research, which is basically to identify which site is limiting the population growth of these shorebirds. However, it turned out that to really answer those questions quantitatively is actually pretty challenging, because we not only need to quantify habitat quality, but actually need to quantify it in terms of its carrying capacity, which is a pretty classic ecological theory, but has not been really widely applied to field research for good reasons. So the carrying capacity is basically how many birds the site can support. But to really get an estimate of it, especially for migratory species, has been very challenging. And there has been very few studies of that on the stopover site, and there has been no study for that for shorebirds at the stopover site, because the birds are always moving, and it's simply very hard to quantify their habitat use. But I think what I could do is that I can get some estimate about the food availability of those habitats. And if we can get some information about the diet composition and the intake rate of those shorebirds, we can get some estimate about how many birds those sites can support, similar to the case where people try to estimate the carrying capacity of the planet for human population. Basically, you need to know how much resources the planet can provide, and on average, per capita consumption for each individual. And if we can compare that with the habitat use intensity, which is basically how many birds are out there actually using the site at the moment, we can sort of get some information about whether this site, specific site, are used at capacity or below its capacity. So apart from the challenges in getting all those information and quantify them in the field, one of the more theoretical challenges that I faced while doing this research is what is a useful unit for us to really measure this habitat use intensity and carrying capacity? And the reason to that is because if we imagine for non-migratory species again, their population or the number of birds at the site is relatively stable at the site. Although there will be some fluctuations in their population due to breeding and mortality of the juveniles, their abundance there, their population there is relatively stable. So we can measure their habitat use and carrying capacity as the abundance. However, for migratory species at slower site, their numbers are always changing throughout the migration period, which is already pretty short. So what people have been using is what is called the peak abundance, which basically the largest amount of birds you observe at the site. So apart from the fact that actually getting this peak abundance depends a lot on how often you sample this distribution. You may well miss the peak abundance if you're not doing the survey very frequently. I think a major problem of the peak abundance is that actually it doesn't consider any of the temporal changes in the habitat, in how birds are using the habitat. We can imagine a case where another site shown by this dashed line here, which has a higher peak abundance. So if we're just looking at peak abundance alone, we may conclude that this site actually is perhaps more important for the shorebirds. But I would argue that this temporal change in the habitat use also matters. We can imagine that when we're out doing a camping trip, how much food you need to prepare for is depend not only on how many people are going out for this trip, but also how long you're planning to stay out camping out there. So I think it's the same thing for the birds at a site. How much habitat quality the habitat need to provide for those shorebirds depends not only on this peak abundance of birds, but how long they spend at those sites. So what I decided to use is basically this bird days. We measure the habitat use in bird days, which effectively this area, the size of the area under this abundance curve, which takes into consideration both how many birds are there and how long they're using the habitat. So to see whether this bird day can be a useful measuring unit for the habitat use intensity and carrying capacity, my collaborators and I devised a proof of concept case study again at Nanpu, my northern field site, focusing on the red knot. So Nanpu is basically the Delaware Bay of China, where more than 40% of red knot concentrate during north migration at this single site. And there, the birds forage almost exclusively on this tiny bivalve, which reaches exceedingly high density, and they don't reproduce during the spring migration, which provide a finite amount of resources. So it's an ideal system for us to really measure the food availability for the site for the birds. And to quantify the bird use and their food resources, we set out this monitoring plot showing by the squares and the monitoring transect showing by those crosses. And what we found is that in terms of food distribution, we sampled their distribution mostly in those plots concentrated on the upper and middle zones, because in the first chapter, or in the first part of the talk, we already found that this is the place where most of the food resources for the red knots are. But just to make sure that we didn't miss any hidden pockets of their food resources, we also set out this transects to ensure a coverage of the entire tidal gradient. And what we found is that at the beginning of the migration season, the food resources are basically concentrated on the upper tidal zone, which is shown by this very warm color. And you can see that on average, not on average, the highest density for those bivalve achieve something like 50,000 individuals per square meter. So it's very high density for the food resources for those tiny little bivalves. And towards the end of the migration season, we can see that this food density has been greatly reduced by this now more color of the habitat. And we actually was able to validate that this decline of food resources was solely contributed by the foraging of red knot, which I won't go into detail here. So we then move on to quantify their habitat use intensity of the red knot and the carrying capacity of Nampu for the red knot. So what we did for the habitat use intensity is that we monitored their population of the red knot throughout the entire site, throughout the entire migration season. And on the x-axis is days in the year, and on the y-axis is a count of the red knot. And each of those dots there represent an actual count that we made for the red knot. And the lines are interpolated based on those actual count. And we estimated that the habitat use intensity of the red knot in that year is around 600,000 bird days. And then with this food distribution as well as the intake rate we estimated for the red knot, we then estimated that the carrying capacity of the site is actually about 900,000 bird days for the red knot, which means that although Nampu has already experienced some habitat loss in the past, and it's still a pretty important site for the red knot, but the current habitat use intensity of the site is just 70% of its carrying capacity. So apart from showing that estimating carrying capacity is challenging but possible, here are some key insights from this case study that we did at Nampu. So I think we show that bird day is actually a pretty useful composite unit to measure habitat use intensity and carrying capacity for the migratory species at stopover site, which takes into consideration both the abundance of birds and their temporal changes. We simply cannot measure how many birds are there at the stopover site because that number is always changing. But more importantly, we show that Nampu, although it's very important for red knot, it may not currently limiting the population of the red knot because the habitat use intensity is below its carrying capacity. So the question is then where the limiting site is for this population, because we know the red knot are clearly declining along this flyway, and how can we identify those limiting sites? So if we look at this very simplified version of their migration network of the red knot, so they have one general breeding area in the Arctic tundra, and they have one general wintering area in Australia and New Zealand. During migration, they pass through two smaller sites in southern China along the coast, and then concentrate to the northern side in Nampu. So from my previous study, what we found is that if we use this circle to represent what we found, the outline of the circle represents the carrying capacity of the site, whereas the fill of the circle represents the habitat use intensity. And we know that at Nampu, the habitat use intensity is lower than its carrying capacity, so the circle is not fully filled. So what I think we need to do to really identify where the limiting site is basically to replicate what we did at Nampu, and at all those different sites, get independent estimate of not only the habitat use intensity, which is what people has been commonly doing, but also we need to get this estimate of its carrying capacity. And with that, assuming that this is what we found, that some of the sites are similar to Nampu that are used under capacity, whereas some other sites are used at capacity. And the most limiting site is actually the site where its habitat use intensity is close to its carrying capacity. Because we can imagine that at those sites, if we shrink the size of the circle or its carrying capacity, it will not only affect how many birds or how intensively those sites can be used at the local scale, but it also affects how many birds can actually pass through those sites. So by changing the habitat at this limiting site, you're not only affecting the local populations, but also affecting their global populations. However, what people has been previously doing mostly is just to look at how important those sites are, or how many birds are there at the stopover site. Whereas in the case of Nampu, we already showed that a site can be very important in terms of how large the proportion of bird it can support. But if it's used under capacity, it may not the place where it needs most imminent conservation or management focus. Those limiting sites are actually where those more imminent conservation actions are required at the global scale for the migratory species. So going back to the two questions that I asked at the beginning of the talk, in terms of how this small loss of habitat can lead to large population declines and how we can identify the conservation priorities for those species. What I showed at the local scale is that there are not just one habitat use patterns, but at least 3 different types of shorebird foraging patterns at the site. And for most of the species, the upper tidal zone is the most important part for their foraging, and is also the most threatened part to human modifications. And then the second part where I talk about how to identify this more limiting, the sites that are most limiting population growth, what we found is that this bird day can be a pretty good measuring unit for bird abundance, for habitat use intensity and carrying capacity, because it takes into consideration both the bird abundance and the duration of habitat use. But more importantly, we really need to get more independent estimate of the carrying capacity in addition to this habitat use intensity, because only by comparing the ratio between the two will we be able to identify where the limiting site is for the birds across a large spatial scale. And I'll now move on to 2 of my ongoing studies addressing those 2 questions at the flyweight scale. So one of the research is to see how consistent the habitat use are for those migratory shorebirds. So in the first part, one thing I didn't mention is that apart from the 3 different types and the disproportionate importance of the upper tidal zone, we also found that the same species can switch their habitat use patterns at different sites. So on this chart here, the first column are species, and the second column is their habitat use patterns at my northern field site in Nampu, and the third column is their habitat use patterns in my southern field site in Rudong. So we can see that some species actually switch their habitat use patterns. And we know that because this habitat use pattern actually linked very tightly to how they may respond to habitat loss. So in this part, I really want to get a quantification of how they're using those habitat throughout the migration. So not just across those 2 those 2 stopover sites, but also across all the stopover sites they use during the migration, but also their wintering and breeding site, using satellite tracking devices. So this satellite tracking technology has just become available for us to really quantify the not just the migration patterns, but also their habitat use patterns for those shorebirds. So this tags can be as light as 3 grams, and they record GPS type signals as frequently as 1 location per hour. So we did a pilot study in northwestern Australia back in 2023 in our winter, their summer of 2023, and in the spring of 2024 they migrate north and spend the boreal summer in Russia, and then migrated back during the fall migration seasons, and now they're all back to northwestern Australia. And these tracks are some of the example tracks of 3 focal species: the red knot, the great knot, and the bar-tailed godwit that will be tracked. You can see that this new satellite transmitting technology has allowed us to not only document their detailed migration patterns, so you see that the curves, this migration paths are no longer those straight lines you see in many of the tracking devices connecting those different spots, but they're actually pretty windy lines that are showing the detailed movement patterns of those birds. But you can also see that those clusters of points are actually showing exactly where those birds are spending long stopover durations. And if we zoom in, we can find that for this particular site in South Korea, in less than 30 days, for one individual, you get more than 900 points of their fixes. So with this valuable data set, I want to ultimately quantify not only their habitat selection, fine-scale habitat selection throughout the year, but also how those shorebirds are using those sites either consistently or inconsistently across different seasons or across different years, to really get some idea about how they're using this stopover site, whether they're changing their habitat selection strategies or not throughout the migration cycle. And then another part of my research is to look at the variations in migration strategies exhibited by this migratory species. So from previous studies, we know that migratory species are declining faster than non-migratory species. And by comparing a small sample of those species, we found that people found that migration strategies actually can affect the population trend of those different migratory species. So for this part, I'm interested in the ecological, physical, and physiological constraints on the migration on the migration strategies that are used by different species, but particularly whether any of those strategies or species are especially vulnerable to the different threats they're facing throughout the migration cycle. And this part of the research will be consists of primarily data compiling from existing studies, including some of my own studies from Australia and in Russia, including getting information about their migration distances and their site feasiblesness throughout the migration cycle, and combine that with the biomorphic measurement, including wing morphology and body size, to test some exciting hypotheses I've already come up with. So going back to the two main goals of the overall project, which is to get some mechanistic understanding behind the population declines of migratory species driven by not only habitat loss, but also all different threats. And based on those mechanistic understanding, how we can facilitate more feasible, effective, and equitable conservation actions on the ground. So my past research focused on local to regional scales, looking at their habitat selection and how we can identify the most limiting site at the regional scale. And my ongoing study expands on the previous studies to actually look at their habitat selection throughout the migration cycle, as well as how those different sites are actually connected by those different migration strategies used by the migratory species. And I think only by combining those different studies across different scales and different angles, we will be really have a more holistic understanding of how those birds are migrating throughout the annual cycle, and how, to actually really enable us to better quantify and predict how those different threats may affect them throughout the migration cycle across different scales. With that, I want to thank my main collaborators for this part of the work, as well as the funding resources, and thanks for your attention. Happy to take any questions.
So Tong will take any questions you might have, and Tong, I'll let you pick and choose the question.
Thanks. Yes.
Thanks so much, Tom. This is super cool.
Thanks.
I was wondering the little schematic at the end you showed, and this is, I'm not a shorebird expert certainly, when you go to approximate the carrying capacity at either the resident or the winter or the breeding site, do you expect that, I'm assuming it'll be quite different than the way you do it at the stopover site, and I'm wondering how you might think about characterizing the percent utilization of
Yeah.
the wintering.
Yeah, thanks. That's a great question. So I think the condition on the wintering site is actually similar to the stopover site, where they're using similar habitat, which is also the coastal tidal flat, intertidal flat. So there, I don't think there will be any more challenge or issue to directly applying what I've talked about. But then it's going to be perhaps slightly different at the breeding site in terms of how we quantify their habitat use and how we may measure those habitat use. But I don't actually have a clear answer of that part yet. But I think that's definitely something that we really need to think more about, because previously when people are quantifying their habitat quality or their habitat use, they focus either on just the abundance as I talked about, but at the breeding site, people has been focused mostly on their vital population parameters, say their survival or their breeding success. But I think in some way it's hard to link to the population sizes in some way. So we really need to get a better connection there. Thanks. Yes?
I was curious about the bivalve a little bit, in the sense that you're describing the carrying capacity as being sort of like what a fraction of the bivalve area was sort of depleted. Is the bivalve having a pelagic larval stage such that it's basically being deposited here from a large area, or are you concerned about the sustainability of the feeding? Because obviously, it could be analogous to telling the fishermen what you can fish with all the fish that are in the ocean.
Yeah.
And then of course next year you don't have any fish.
Right.
So I was curious, like, what kind of biology and how they interact with the fish.
Yeah, so thanks for the great question. So I didn't mention the details about the biology of the bivalve there. So this tiny bivalve, and the reason because they're so tiny is because they're actually just the young stage of larger bivalves. So the larger ones actually reside in the shallow sea or the lower tidal zones close to the shallow sea. And those ones are just the new generations of the bivalve that was reproduced the previous year. So in effect, shorebirds can actually harvest most of those bivalves without affecting the general population of the adult stage. And in my study, we actually considered that it's not just all the bivalves are available for shorebirds. There's a certain threshold below which the shorebirds cannot actually feed effectively. So in a way, they will leave some young bivalves to move on to the next stage. And their harvesting by the shorebirds won't actually affect this regeneration or the growth or the maintenance of the population to some extent. Yeah. So this is a pretty unique system, and that's part of the reason why we can actually estimate the carrying capacity for this species at the site.
Any other questions for Tong? If not, Tong, thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
Thanks.